Alright, in this video I wanted to go over a new build that I've been playing and I've really been enjoying it. It is a PvE light armor tank build. Now, before I really get into it, I wanted to say that this is probably the most enjoyable build that I've played since I discovered the rapier like 3 years ago. So me saying that just shows it's a very fun build. However, there is a caveat to that, and the fact is it's very hard to play just because you're going to be using light armor. So there's a decent amount of stuff that I'll have to explain as we go over this build, just to explain how it works and why it works. The build I'll be showcasing in this video has a few key points which make it both very strong and sometimes very weak. Let's go over those now. The first benefit of running this build is its mobility, speed, and power, thanks to being in light armor. The second benefit of this build is its survivability during specifically big mob clumps. Later in the video, I'll talk more about why this is the case. The third benefit to this build is the fact that getting and holding aggro is fairly easy thanks to 3 AoE taunts and bleed procs. Finally, as is the case with all of my builds, it's simply a satisfying build to play. Now, these benefits come at the cost of some downsides. One of those being this build is a lot less tankier than a heavy armor setup, which means this build is mainly for lower level dungeons and random mutations. Another disadvantage to running this build is its difficulty. There are a lot of key pieces that go into making this build function correctly, and without a clear understanding of those mechanics, you will struggle. However, I'll do my best to explain everything involved in making this build work. Lastly, this build relies on dodging, so having a good understanding of specifically boss movesets is almost a requirement. Alright, so for the Sword and Shield skill tree, we're going to be running 3 abilities. Firstly, Whirling Blade. This will be used for applying bleeds, as we are going to be using the Butcher for this build. Second is Shield Rush to apply a weaken on enemies within 5 meters. It's a 20% weaken, so it's pretty strong. Once you have them clumped, that's a free weaken. And lastly, Defender's Resolve to taunt everybody in an AoE clump. So right before you're about to burn the clump, you're going to pop Defender's Resolve. This will also give you some damage reduction, so that's pretty useful as well. But more importantly, it will taunt enemies. That is the Sword and Shield tree. Now let's look at the Greatsword tree. So we're going to be running Relentless Rush. This is your opener before a clump, basically. You want to just get in there, use Relentless Rush. The reason for using this first is, I guess, two purposes. The first purpose is to go through enemies. So if there's enemies kind of in your way, you can go right through them with this ability. And the second reason is to get into Onslaught stance. And that will allow you to immediately use Roaring Rupture, which will pull enemies in. As you can see, it says, in Onslaught, enemies will be pulled in. So you're going to be basically using Relentless Rush into Roaring Rupture, and that will clump enemies towards you. After you've done those 2 abilities, then you can use Calamity Counter, which will taunt all the enemies in an AoE. So this will also hold up a block, obviously, so you can hold this up for a decent amount of time until all the enemies are clumped, and then let go of it, and it will stun everything to the ground. So it's very, very good. It's a good combo to use, is these 3 together. Alright, so next up, we're going to be taking a look at our attribute point distribution. Firstly, we want to make sure we're at 300 con to pick up this attribute perk, which is we gain grit on heavy attacks. That's a very important thing, so make sure you have 300 con. And then basically the rest you want to put into strength. Ideally, you reach at least 300 strength, so make sure you're using attribute food, something like banana parfait or banana bread. Both of these will give either strength or con. So that's the those are the attributes. Okay, next up we're going to be going over the gear that I'm using. Now I want to make something clear. You don't need to replicate this one-to-one. So some of these perks and stuff that I'll go over, there are actually better alternatives, but I will cover kind of like the key things that you'll need. Starting off with the Butcher, you'll definitely need this. It's kind of like the backbone of this build, just because we're going to be using Whirling Blade so much. And then for the perk that you want to put on this, you want to put Distained Infliction. I kind of made a mistake and put Keenly Jagged on here, but definitely Distained Infliction is the one that you want to put on here. And then for the Hoplite Greatsword, or I guess for the Greatsword, I like the Hoplite Greatsword as an option here. If you don't have the Hoplite Greatsword, then realistically, just something similar. The Greatsword's not too important, I would say, because most of the time we're going to be using the Butcher. So, yeah. For our armor, almost everything should have Enchanted Ward. In fact, I'd strongly recommend that. And I'd also strongly recommend having everything with slash conditioning. So, yeah, I'll briefly just show this. Featherweight has shirking heals, so ignore that, I guess. But ideally, you put something like Enchanted Ward on here. But it's not a huge deal, I guess, if you have one piece that isn't. But yeah, everything else is Enchanted Ward, slash conditioning. We have 4 out of 4 on refreshing. This piece has health. We're not using crosscut, so ignore that third perk on this. You could probably have something like health or refreshing on here. For the shield, I think this is a decent shield that has Fortifying Shield Rush. That's a perk that you definitely want, by the way. It's a very important weapon perk. And then it has Vicious. Enchanted Ward is also very important. So make sure you have a shield with Fortifying Shield Rush and Enchanted Ward. For the jewelry, basically just make sure you have an amulet that has health and a protection perk. So let's say you're doing a Void mutation, you'd want Void Protection amulet. Makes sense? And then for the ring, we're going to be using Blood Drinker. This will allow us to survive big clumps. And then for the third perk, you want to put on Keen Awareness. As a tank, you're not really going to be doing backstab, so having some extra crit chance is really nice. And then for the earring, I think this is a really good earring here. Nimble, Despised, and Refreshing. So something similar, I would say, but make sure you have Nimble and Despised. I would say those are probably the most important perks. And then our Heart Rune is Cunning Heart Rune of Stone Form, and this is very important to get this Heart Rune because it's what allows this build to perform so well on big clumps. Okay, so now I basically just want to kind of explain a simple explanation on how to play the build, starting off with the core idea of tanking in general, which is clumping all the adds in one section, usually at an elite boss, and then burning them down at that location. So it's gonna be a lot of trial and error if you haven't really experienced tanking before. This is more of an advanced build anyways, so hopefully you already have some understanding of tanking to begin with. But yeah, you basically just want to clump as much as you can. This build really succeeds when you have a massive clump. Now the reason for that is because your stone form is going to come off cooldown very, very, very quickly, thanks to how often you can use Whirling Blade. Whirling Blade will apply a bleed, and if you're hitting something like 5 or 6 enemies with a Whirling Blade, it's going to be an instant cooldown reduction of stone form, and in a lot of cases they'll actually overlap, so you'll have a stone form available to use while already being in stone form, which is pretty insane. Another reason, of course, is the bleeds. So you're going to be doing a lot of damage, and in a lot of cases you could clear a big clump of enemies just by yourself because you can apply so many bleeds, and it does a ton of damage. Now I want to make something clear, and I mentioned this in my disadvantage section in the beginning of this video, but this isn't necessarily a build for high, M3 content or for the raid or anything. It can be used in there, and if you are a good player, it definitely is viable. However, the barrier of entry to tanking some of that higher end stuff with this build is very, very difficult, and in most cases I would just say run heavy armor instead. But the reason that I love this build so much is because it's so fun to play. And part of the reason I love it so much is because whenever you do the random mutation and the random expeditions every day, I just run with this build, and it is such an enjoyable experience because you can just pull so much, and you really just don't die. Like, if you're playing it correctly, you can get super greedy and you won't die. Alright, so another thing I want to talk about is utilizing grit when it comes to big mob clumps, because if you don't know, in the past you used to be able to have grit with light attacks, so it was pretty easy to just spam left click and get away with that. But with a new change, you only have grit during heavy attacks. So what this means is you want to make sure that if you don't have a stone form ready, don't try to go for a whirling blade unless you really know that you can get away with it, because that ability does not have grit. So the only time you're using whirling blade is when you're in a big clump and you have stone form fully utilized, and then you can just repeat using whirling blade. If you don't have stone form, there are a couple of options. One of them is to block. You should realistically not be blocking too much. If you're blocking a couple of enemies, then that's fine. Just be sure to avoid if there's any like big heavy attacks coming out. Another option is to just spam heavy attacks with your sword and shield, and that's typically what I tend to do if I don't have stone form available. Another option is to use either Defiant Stance or Defender's Resolve or Shield Rush. Both of those have grit, so you know, that's a good idea. Basically what you want to do is stall until you have stone form as much as possible during the big clumps. If it's just a couple of enemies, then it shouldn't be a problem. And then of course for bosses and stuff, it's all about just understanding the attacks and blocking and dodging when necessary. But you know, you have to remember this is a light armor tank build, so you don't want to block too much. Like if you're used to playing Tower Shield, for example, this build is a lot different in how it plays, because you're going to be swapping a lot of those blocks that you normally would be doing with dodges instead, and utilizing it that way. Okay, so that about covers it for the build guide. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I hope you enjoyed. See you guys in the next one.